my name is Kara, and today let's do a little knit and chat. So I have some cotton slub yarn from Trendsetter yarn's spessotille, and it's in yellow, and I've been dying to make a top-down sweater with it, and now I'm going to take that time to do it, see how far I get, and also talk to you about some of the mistakes that I've made while knitting recently. Okay, so I'm starting at the very beginning with this sweater, so I'm going to be very loosely following my Benny sweater pattern because I don't really want to take the time to think about anything else, and I find the Benny sweaters very relaxing, and I can do that basically in my sleep. So I can concentrate on talking to you guys while also doing it at the same time. However, when I'm stitch counting, I'm gonna be going offline or off camera because that's tricky. So I have been knitting a lot this summer because I am basically right now just a full-time knitter slash content creator because I am in between jobs. Well, I just graduated and I don't start my full-time job till October because I decided to take that time for myself just to get bored, and I have not been bored yet. I've just been knitting a bunch this summer and it's been really fun, really enjoying my time. And so knitting a lot means that I have also made a lot of knitting mistakes recently. I mean, the first knitting mistake that I make right now is honestly probably that I'm going to overestimate how much yarn I needed for this long tail cast on. I never ever measure how much I need. I just guess, and it is very often wrong. I'm also not entirely sure how this yarn will turn out with ribbing because it's so thick and thin. Like, the thin parts are probably like 10% of the width of the thick part, so it's like pretty drastic change, but I don't know, we're just gonna keep on casting on until I see how many stitches I have, and I might just have a really long tail for that, but that's okay because I have a lot of this yarn left over, and I would much rather have it be a too long tail than a too short tail, because you can live with the too long tail because you can just cut that yarn later. You can't live with the too short tail because then you'll just have to start over. 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, 32. Okay, I've casted on all my stitches and I was very right. I made a tail that was far too long, but I'm just gonna cut that now because if I don't cut it now, it's very likely that I will accidentally try to use that yarn later on as the working yarn because I'll get them mixed up. So better to cut it now before I make that mistake. Okay, so I have joined in the round and I'm pretty sure that these aren't twisted because that brings me to the first mistake that I've made recently is that I joined stitches in the round and they were twisted, and then I started working without noticing it. So I was doing this for my Valerie vest, which is a v-neck vest that I had. And I was really excited because I was using a contrast ribbing, so I was using a different yarn for the ribbing than I was for the rest of the body. And it was my first time using the Noro yarn, so I was super excited, and I was just taking a look at it because I was like, oh, I just switched from the ribbing yarn to the body yarn because I had actually started on the botting, so I had done all 8 rows of ribbing before I realized that, in fact, I had twisted the stitches. And I'm not sure if you've ever done that before, but when you twist the stitches, it just basically makes it so that everything's twisted and it just, you can't untwist it without flipping some of the work. And so I just had to undo that entire sweater. It wasn't that much, it was only 10 rows of work, but I was so mad at myself because this is just something that you get so used to doing because you're kind of mechanical, just joining in the round and making sure that your stitches aren't twisted. And I just hadn't double checked thoroughly enough before doing it. And that actually brings me to the second time that I did this recently. So the Valerie vest was a week and a half ago when I twisted the stitches and then I had to undo everything and start over, which again, unfortunately didn't take me that long, but I was so mad because it was 8 rows of ribbing that I had to redo. First, it was 8 rows of ribbing that I did, and then I had to undo it, and then I had to do it again. And the second time I did it, actually, I figured out that I used less yarn because I think I was knitting the ribbing tighter because I knew exactly how much contrast yarn I needed for that, and so I used less that time around, which was really strange. I don't know. And so I did this twisting of stitches before joining the round a second time recently with mohair, and I had cast on 132 stitches, and I was like, there's no way that I'm gonna undo this. And fortunately I realized literally on the first row of ribbing that things were twisted, so what I did was I don't think I twisted these stitches, but if the stitches were twisted, I just literally twisted it around nobody can tell because the yarn's so thin that like you can't even see the twist in the work, but I'll know that those stitches are twisted, and I'll also know that there was no way that you were going to make me undo all of that cable cast on. And it was only cable cast on, but it was mohair, and mohair is so tricky to undo. So I just left it and I just kept on knitting, which brings me to the next mistake that I've made recently, and that is just trying to undo mohair while knitting. And I know that somewhere it says that you can, I don't know where it says that. I have a friend that told me that you can put mohair in the freezer and then you can try to undo it, because that'll make it a lot easier to undo. Because I don't know if you've ever tried to unravel mohair before, but it's super, super sticky. So all the fibers kind of get tangled in one another and there's a lot of ripping and it's just not very smooth. And I tried to undo mohair without putting it in the freezer. And then I got super frustrated because things kept on getting really tangled and it just kind of became a really big mess. And honestly, I got really frustrated, so I didn't correct the mistake. I just put the project aside and am never going to touch it again because I can't unravel it and I don't want to move forward with it either. So it'll just go into some corner that'll never get looked at again. And the way that I typically unravel sweaters, if I can unravel them, is I will find the ends, like undo them and start unraveling. But to make sure that it's neat as I'm unraveling so I can reclaim that yarn, I like to use my skein winder and kind of skein it up at the same time as I'm unraveling it. But my skein winder is a little bit sketchy because one time I got a bunch of yarn tangled up in like the gears and I had to like use scissors, and basically my skein winder makes a very scary noise whenever I wind skeins up, but it's not the strongest and it always gets kind of jammed. So using that to unwind a sweater of mohair that's super sticky already, so you have to use like, it just keeps on getting caught and tangled, and then you like, it gets like, it pulls really hard on the skein winder, was bad. That's why unraveling that mohair sweater was not very successful. The next knitting mistake that I've made recently is that I'm always making little gauge swatches, but I don't think I ever really match the gauge of other patterns that aren't my own. Because like when I'm knitting for myself or like designing a pattern, like I determine the gauge. Like it's whatever I say it is, basically, because like I write the pattern, I write basically for my own knitting, and I never really thought about whether or not my knitting was loose or tight. And I think over the 2 years that I've been knitting, my gauge has definitely gotten looser. Not really sure why, but I've also found out that like knitting in the round is, I have a different gauge for knitting in the round than I do knitting flat, because I think my purl stitches tighten things up, if that makes sense. So I'm a tighter knitter when I have purl rows to do. When it's just all knit stitches, like in the round, it gets a bit looser. And look how this is turning out. It's very interesting with ribbing with this yarn. But yeah, so when I follow other people's patterns, I don't do a good job of checking gauge or just try to match gauge, or if anything, I check gauge, match it, but that's me knitting a flat swatch versus knitting in the round. And the example that I'm talking about is that I made the Flutter Butt shorts by Jessie Made Designs, and I'm pretty sure I matched gauge, but I didn't want to use like a sport weight yarn or finger weight yarn, whatever that pattern calls for, so I used the Feeling Good yarn from Wool and the Gang. And I was like, oh yeah, this will match, because I knit a gauge swatch flat, by the way, and I was like, yeah, this matches. And of course I knit the pattern in the round because it's knit in the round, and it turned out to be ginormous. Like it's way, way, way bigger than what the pattern calls for when I knit in the round, because it basically, it just expands. So these shorts, they do fit me because it's a drawstring waist, so I like tie it really, really tight to make it fit my waist. But like each of the leg holes is about, like I can fit my full like waist and hips through those leg holes because they're so big. And yeah, that just means that I have shorts that are super duper flowy, and that wasn't really what I wanted. But if I had known better, I would have knit a gauge swatch in the round, and so I would have figured out whether I needed to size down needles, which I did need to size down needles, but I didn't. And this is another example of like, I had a bunch of stitches casted on and I started knitting and I was like, this looks a lot bigger than the pictures. But I was like, no, it's gonna be fine. And it wasn't fine, because the shorts turned out way bigger than I had hoped, and now I either need to unravel them or I need to give them away, to my sister. Okay, this ribbing's looking a little strange. Like, I don't think I really like pulled hard on this one, but I think that the thick and thin texture is really kind of messing with the ribbing of this sweater, so I might just switch to doing the body now instead of doing any more rows of ribbing because it looks a bit strange. But the next knitting mistake that I've made recently is just always trying to knit in the round. And I love knitting in the round because I really don't like purling, because I think that I found with the way that I knit with continental, it's continental style, so you can actually see me doing it here. So like I knit and I purl both in like a continental style. I believe it's continental knitting, but it's Norwegian purling. Either way, like the yarn's always like on my left finger here instead of like the traditional like English knitting where you do knit and then you bring the yarn forward and then you purl. And I haven't done this in like 2 years, so because basically the reason why I switched to continental knitting was because I didn't like having to switch the yarn back and forth when doing ribbing, and that's literally my entire motivation for learning how to do continental knitting. But I find that my purls are a bit wonky doing this, and it's a lot more obvious with like super bulky yarn because the stitches are a lot bigger so that you can see like how uneven my texture can be when I do a purl side. So I actually tend to knit English style on purl rows when I'm doing like super bulky yarn. And so that's why I like to knit in the round all the time, because knit stitches are just super easy. So I've avoided at all costs trying to seam anything because that means that you have to knit flat. And there's nothing wrong with knitting flat. And hold on, I'm switching to my other needles here. And I couldn't find my 9mm, so I'm just using 8mm here because, I don't know, I'm just kind of freestyle. I'm loosely following my own pattern, so I can kind of do whatever I want. So yeah, there's nothing wrong with knitting flat. It's just that I don't like to, and I feel like I could get a lot better at seaming, but because I avoid seaming at all cost, that means I'm not going to improve my seaming at all. And it just means that I keep on avoiding seaming because my seaming isn't very neat, and it definitely can be neater. And I think that the issue is that I tend to pull from like different columns sometimes when I'm like picking up the bars of stitches on the seaming. And so that makes it look a little bit wonky. And sometimes it turns out really neat because I'm good about staying in like the same column, and sometimes I'm not very good at putting those stitches together. Okay, I have all these stitch markers in place, so I've just been doing increases, and this is a little bit easier for me to focus on talking to you guys and also knit at the same time because I'm kind of getting into the more like automatic parts of this pattern where it's just like increases, knit rows, increases, knit rows and stuff. So the next mistake that I made recently was that I designed a top in a super chunky mohair. So that's Loopy Mango Mohair So Soft, which is around 50 grams per 60 meters. So it's like a super chunky mohair. And then I decided to make the same top in about 4 strands of mohair, of just like regular mohair, which is around 50 grams for 400 meters. So much, much, much thinner. And the issue was that I knew how the fabric was going to turn out. It turned out a lot lighter, a lot like more see-through, and I wanted that. But I forgot to account for the fact that mohair isn't super stretchy when it's like that thin. And so when I cast it off, I basically like it felt like it was gonna rip because there was no stretch to the cast off at all, because I just did like a regular cast off, and I definitely needed like a stretchier cast off for that one because the mohair had like no give. And I don't know what the proper terminology is for any of this, but like basically it was fine that I had cast it off normally with the other sample top because the super chunky mohair had a lot more stretch to it, maybe just because it's chunkier, but the much thinner mohair, even though it was held 4 strands together, was a lot less giving. So again, it just felt like I was going to rip it when wearing it, so I had to undo all that, but undoing mohair is a nightmare. So what I decided to do, this led to my next mistake, but what I decided to do was to put in a lifeline. And the lifeline is just like, it actually was like a post lifeline. I don't know what you call it, but I just took another needle and I picked up all the stitches from the same row, a few rows down before the cast off and before any of the shaping, because I actually wanted to add a lot more length to it. So I took another set of needles and just like threaded it through one row of stitches. And I was planning to just like cut the mohair from there, like cut the top itself above the lifeline so I could undo it, and then as you undo it, it eventually gets caught on the needles or on the stitches that you've caught up on the needles, so it's as if you've always had that yarn on your needles, or sorry, always had those stitches on your needles, so you could just keep on knitting from there. And it's as if like everything that happened after that, like the bad cast off, the non-stretchy cast off, didn't happen. And so that was my plan, and I ended up doing it, but I didn't pick up stitches from the same row. So that meant that there were some stitches on my needles from different rows from one another. So I was trying to unravel everything, and it just wasn't going super smoothly because some stitches from one row were getting like caught as I undid it on the needles, but then other stitches were further down below those stitches. And so it was just really messy. And it took a lot of, basically I just had to choose a row that I caught with my needles and just like undo all the other stitches and like kind of redo the lifeline a few times. And this took up a lot of time, but I'm glad that I did it, because if I had just like cut the mohair and then unraveled it and then tried to pick up the stitches from there, I find that that's a lot messier, especially because it was 4 strands of mohair and it was kind of dark, so it was like a lot, very straining on the eyes. So it was a bad cast on, or sorry, it was a bad lifeline, but it was a lot better than the other options. And so going in the future, I would definitely do the lifeline much more carefully, but now that I recall, it was hard to see where the stitches of the same row were because the stitches were so small. So the next bit of blocking, sorry, I have like a little tangle in my yarn, so I'm trying to undo that. But the next series of mistakes that I've made have been regarding blocking, and I'm sure I'm making even more mistakes than I realized while blocking because I'm not super used to blocking. I was gonna say super expert, but that doesn't make any sense. I'm not an expert on blocking because I used to not really do it that much. And the reason why is because I used to really work mostly with super bulky yarns, and that was a fun era of my life, but now I'm exploring and using different types of yarn which actually do need blocking. And I can see why I didn't block that much when I worked mostly with super bulky yarns, because it's so time consuming and it takes so long to dry anything because it's super bulky. And so those knits really soak up a lot of water, and it's not easy to get them to dry. Like it takes like maybe even a week. So that's probably, it's definitely why I didn't block that much. And I also don't think that super bulky yarns are as affected by blocking as lighter weight yarns. So we can call like not blocking my knits like mistake 0.5, because it was partly due to the fact that like I didn't really know what blocking could do, but also because like I worked with super bulky yarns a lot, so I didn't want to block them. Another blocking mistake that I've made was that I used to take the knit out of the sink, which because I always block in the sink, and I used to put it on a towel and then like roll it to soak up more water. But I don't think that was that effective. Maybe I just wasn't doing it right, but it kind of tended to just make my floor super wet because like you're supposed to like sit and press on the towel with the knit in it, and then so much water came out of the knit and into the towel that it would soak the towel and like make it so that the floor was wet, and also like my knees were wet, like everything. It was very messy and I just didn't really like it, which is again another reason why I didn't tend to block so much, because not only was it super time consuming because it took like a week to dry anything, but it also like just was very messy. So I figured out actually that I like to, instead of just taking the knit like out of the sink and like wringing it a little bit, not wringing it, but like squeezing out some of the water and then taking the rest out with a towel, I actually spend a lot more time trying to get rid of the water in the sink more. Sorry, get rid of the water in the knit while it's in the sink before taking it out. So that means just like squeezing it really hard and making sure not to wring it before I take it out of the sink at all. And I've actually skipped the towel part entirely because I just thought it was kind of like a waste, and just like figuring out where to dry the towel after that was kind of annoying. Well, I have towel racks, but I just I don't know. This one's not really a mistake, but it's just something that I've stopped doing. But I used to, as the water was running into the sink and filling it up, I would actually put the soap in so that it became kind of like a bubble bath for my knit, which is fine. It just makes it super foamy and you actually can't see like your knit. And, like, well, it's bad because you can't see if all parts of the piece are like saturated or underneath water. So I've stopped doing that. I actually tend to put in the soap now after, when the sink is full, and then just stir it in with my hands. but I've stopped like making the bubble bath, which isn't as fun. But it was kind of getting annoying with all the bubbles everywhere. Which brings me to my next blocking mistake, which is just not really being aware of how blocking will affect your knit, because I know that people do like to knit a gauge swatch and then actually block it and let it dry just to see how it will affect the yarn and the fabric that they're making. I don't do that. If anything, I knit a gauge swatch, and that's if you're lucky, but I will not block that gauge swatch to see how things are going. And that's my mistake, because I knit a dress recently and I blocked it because I didn't add ribbing at the bottom because it curled up at the edges. So I was like, cool, blocking can help that. I know that that'll clean things up and make it lie flat. But then I wasn't super prepared for how making sure that the edge doesn't curl up will actually, I accidentally stretched out the dress even though I wasn't using pins, just by the process of like getting the dress wet and laying it flat to dry, but not letting it like be like super, it was like slightly stretched. So the dress became 1 to 2 inches a little bit longer, and this might also just be because like it no longer curled up at the bottom, but it did startle me a little bit. So this happened to me again recently too, where I made a sweater, and then again, same thing, I didn't add ribbing at the bottom, so it curled up at the edges. So I was like, cool, let me block it, it'll clean things up. And this is like a completely different set of needles and yarn. So I didn't expect this either, because I then knew what to expect with my other dresses when I was knitting with those needles and like similar-ish yarns. But then I was startled when something very similar to me happened. Something very similar happened to me again when I knit a sweater and then blocked it, and then it came out a lot longer, which actually was a nice look because I thought it was a bit cropped. But it did startle me again, even though these happened within like days of each other, like within at least like a week of itself. Within a week of each other. So my next mistake is also tension related, in that I recently made a top that was way too small for me, and it was my nail art inspired top, which I made a whole video about, but the top itself turned out way smaller than I had intended it to, and it's because I was loosely basing it off of my back and forth pattern, which is it's made for super bulky weight yarn, and I was using bulky weight yarn and needles that weren't that much smaller, but it was more that the yarn made a big difference, and I didn't knit a gauge swatch beforehand. So I was basically doing decreases in the same way that I would normally do with a super bulky weight yarn, but it was the same number of decreases spaced over a smaller length, because the bulky weight yarn doesn't have, or it needs more rows to achieve the same length as a super bulky yarn. So the decreases came too fast, basically. That's the short story. And so I made a top that was way too small for me. And if I had knit a gauge swatch beforehand, I would have realized that like, hey, maybe I should space these decreases out over more rows than I originally do for my back and forth top, which is what I was basing it off of. But I didn't, and I made a top that was too small for me, and lesson learned, I will keep that in mind, that you can't adapt a super bulky weight pattern to a bulky weight pattern without thinking. You can't just like do it. You have to do some sort of math trickery for that. Which reminds me that somebody recently asked me if they could knit one of my patterns with a 3mm needles, and the pattern itself is written for 12mm needles. And they wanted to knit on 3mm needles with like finger weight yarn, but I was like, no, this is for super bulky weight yarn. And I was like, please don't do this. You're going to knit a top for a child, if you're lucky. So that's not technically my mistake that I made, but it just reminds me that somebody asked me that recently, and I totally get it. I did something very similar when I first started knitting. I made the Louisiana sweater by Petite Knits, and that's made for like, I think bulky weight yarn or like sport weight yarn. I don't know, something definitely less than what I ended up using, because I was like, oh cool, let me just knit this pattern with 12mm needles and super bulky weight yarn. And I was getting so tired because I was like, this is taking forever and this sweater is turning out huge. And I'll include a picture if I can find it, but the sweater turned out like, it was actually kind of cute, but it looked nothing like a Louisiana sweater. And that ended up being my first top-down sweater, I think. And again, this isn't recent, but another mistake that I made with that Louisiana sweater was that I didn't knit my make one lefts, or my left leaning increases, through the back loop. And so that created a nice hole where my increases were, and I was like, what's going on? and it's because I wasn't knitting the increased stitch through the back loop. And ever since then, I've been super careful on all of my patterns and every single time I do a tutorial to let people know, like, hey, if you do a left knitting increase, you need to knit through the back loop to make sure that there's no hole in your increase. And maybe it's just because, like, when I was a new knitter, I didn't read the instructions carefully enough, but, like, I don't know if I see it everywhere that, like, when you do a left knitting increase, you should knit through the back loop, because otherwise you can create a hole in your work, or it looks like there's a hole in your work. But that's just something that's been ingrained in me for the past 2 years, ever since I made my first, like, top-down sweater, because, like, I made that sweater and I was super proud of it, but then I was like, why are all these holes on the side that has the left knitting increases? Until I was, like, doing a bunch of Googling, and it wasn't super easy to find the solution or the reason why I kept on having these holes. Another mistake that I've made relatively recently is that today, is that I made a top and I didn't allow for enough shoulder length, armhole length. Basically this gap here, like when you stop knitting the very bottom, you start knitting the top and the back, and then you seam them together, the armhole itself was not wide enough. Like, I can definitely fit my arm through, but I have broader shoulders, I think, and so it really bothers me when the armholes are tight. And so I've been very careful with allowing more armhole length ever since, like, I knit my first sweater, because my first sweater was seamed, and so seaming on the sleeves made it so that the armhole gap hole was much smaller, so it was very tight on the shoulders, and I actually ended up unraveling that entire sweater, which is another reason why I think I avoid seaming, is because, like, seaming on the sleeves, like, just takes up so much time, but it also makes the sleeve less comfortable to wear, or the sweater less comfortable to wear because of the seam being on the shoulders. But I'm hoping that the solution for this one is actually to just block it and lengthen it, because I actually want the top longer anyways. So hopefully that's the solution. Instead of just letting that top die in a corner somewhere, because I don't want to wear it, because I really don't like it when tops or sweaters are tight on my shoulders. And I'm sure nobody likes it when a top or a sweater is tight on their shoulders, but I tend to just, like, give the sweater away to my mom if that happens to me, because my mom has smaller shoulders than me, so it's not uncomfortable for her, but I refuse to wear it if it's tight on my shoulders. And this next one is kind of sinister, because not everybody might consider it a mistake, and I used to not really consider it a mistake until I thought about it, but I tend to overestimate how much yarn I'll need for any given project. So the way that I like to buy yarn is I like to buy yarn without a specific project in mind, and I like to let the yarn inspire me rather than kind of forcing myself to think about these things. So I'll buy yarn for a project, and because I don't know what type of project I'll be making with it, I buy enough yarn to make any sort of project I might make. So, like, any length or size of sweater I want to make. And so this usually means that because I like to make, like, small cropped sweaters, and I don't know why I never keep that in mind, maybe one day I hope that I'll do something different. But basically, that means that I usually have a lot of yarn left over from any given project, and it's not enough yarn to actually, like, make a whole nother project. But it's enough yarn that, like, it bothers me, because I'm like, well, I have a skein and a half left. What do I do with it? And I've been trying to solve this problem for a few months now, because, like, I've just been, like, racking my brain for, like, ideas for, like, scrap yarn project. And I know that there are a lot of scrap yarn patterns out there, but, like, I haven't found any that, like, super inspire me, or just, like, haven't honestly really looked into it that much. So I've just been trying to, like, force myself to creatively come up with something of my own, or just, like, inspired by. I have no idea. Like, I have an entire box of the Melted Baby Suri yarn from Ching Fibers, and they're all just, like, left over some other projects, but so they're not enough to be projects on their own, and they're not enough to just, like, I don't know what you would do otherwise, but I've just been holding on to them forever, and I don't know what to do with them, because basically I like really bright, bold colors, which don't necessarily go together because they're so bright and bold, and there's, like, no, like, neutral to hold them together. So if you have any ideas, let me know. But I've been, like, slowly racking my brain on how to use them up, because I don't want to be wasteful. And the yarn's really expensive, but so pretty. And this next is not necessarily a mistake, but it's definitely something that I want to change. And it's kind of that I tend to get really stuck on a certain type of yarn. And so like I'll only think about that yarn, I'll buy a bunch of it, and I just like will have a bunch of it in my stash. And this is super obvious because I have a lot of Ching Fiber Melted Baby Suri because I was obsessed with it at one point, and I still kind of am, but I tend to get really focused in on a certain type of yarn and can't think of anything else for a while. And so I think it's really fun when you explore different types of yarn and try different things. And I think the summer has really forced me to do that because, again, I used to really only knit with super bulky yarn for a while. But because it's summer, I was like, that doesn't make any sense. You should work with lighter weight yarns. And by lighter weight, I mean bulky. And so I didn't really push myself to try different types of yarn because I was so set on a certain type of yarn. And I bought a bunch and I was like, well, I got to use it now. So that kind of put me in a pigeonhole. Or it forced me to work a lot with the same type of yarn and not really explore as much as I would like to. And so I, unfortunately, have been kind of going through a bunch of different phases of yarn recently. So not only was I into Melted Baby Suri yarns, now I'm kind of into the mohair game of like super chunky mohairs. And now I'm moving on to just like a lighter weight mohair and just like holding that with lighter weight yarns like DK and like sport weight. And so I'm pretty excited for this new era of knitting for myself because it's just exciting. Like it opens up a whole new world of yarn for me, and like, yeah, like it's a lot more economical, if that makes sense, because like 2 skeins of like DK can make a sweater instead of like say 5 skeins, which is what I kind of got used to. And it's a lot more expensive with like super bulky weight yarn because there's a lot less yardage. And recently I've gotten into lace knitting, which means that there's a whole world of mistakes in that, because lace knitting is really hard because it's just tricky to read the charts. Like it definitely takes practice and concentration to read those charts, and I'm just getting there. So I've recently made a lot of mistakes while doing lace knitting stitches, and I actually spent a whole evening making like little gauge swatches of lace stitches because even if it looks pretty in the book, it's really nice for you to knit a gauge swatch just to see like, oh, does it look good in this yarn that I had in mind, or does it not even show up because the yarn's too fluffy or doesn't have enough definition, or is it like too complicated because I don't want to just be like staring at the chart the entire time that I'm knitting, because that's not a very pleasant experience. So there's a whole world of mistakes that I've made with lace knitting. But recently I started a sweater and I was really excited about it. So excited to the point where I looked at the chart and was like, cool, I know how to do that. Not even gonna knit a gauge swatch. Which is dumb because I was just doing all those little gauge swatches for those knitting stitches. So I did like 11 rows of the pattern, and then I got to the final pattern row and I was like, I don't know how to read this. Like, I don't know what it means. And if I had knit a tiny little gauge swatch, I would have been like, I don't know what that means. Maybe I can fix it. Maybe I can't. Maybe the internet will help me. I tried to look it up on the internet. I didn't really know what was going on. It's like an edge stitch. I don't know what that does for lace knitting. If you do, let me know. So because I didn't knit the little gauge swatch and because I didn't look at the chart super closely, I ended up putting in a lifeline and undoing the entire 11 rows of the pattern stitch that I had done already. And then because I didn't want to undo the entire thing, I kept the ribbing and I actually switched to another knitting lace stitch, and I had knit a tiny gauge swatch for that, so I knew that I could read the pattern for that. So yeah, that's how I fixed a mistake, is that I just switched to a different lace stitch. And this brings me to my final knitting mistake recently, is that I probably made a million mistakes while talking to you guys with this pattern. I'm sure that I skipped some increases where I should have put them, and I'm sure that I added them where I shouldn't have. But fortunately, this yarn it's not super forgiving because it's not really easy to work with, but maybe it is super forgiving because like you can't really see if you made a mistake anywhere because the yarn texture is just so crazy. So fortunately for me, a top-down sweater is super forgiving. Like if you miss an increase somewhere, that's okay, just add it on the next row. And if you added an increase, that's okay, just omit it on the next row. And I'm just gonna have to go through and just count all my stitches and like between the stitch markers to make sure that I didn't make a mistake somewhere, even though I know I did, and just like figure out where I need to fix it. So that's part of the reason why I love making top-down sweaters, because they're just so forgiving and they're really relaxing. You just have to like kind of learn how to read a row, like, oh, did I make an increase on this last stitch marker, or is this a knit row? And I've gotten pretty good at just like recognizing and reading how to read that for a top-down sweater. But yeah, that is all of the mistakes that I can think of recently. I'm sure that there are more, but that's all that I can think of off the top of my head. And thanks for sticking with me as I ramble on and work on this sweater. I've made maybe like a third of the top, but I'm liking that I can see how the texture is turning out, and it seems really cool. Like, I'm just holding it up against this like white wall because I think it looks really pretty. But yeah, hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Happy knitting, and see ya.